Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 930B, and today's date is March 28th, 2016, and the title of the episode is More Alerts and Warnings for Europe and the Middle East as More Attacks Are Planned. Let's get into the economic collapse, political, and geopolitical news. Now, out in Greece, we realize at the time where Tsipras was making deals with the bankers, Russia was in there, the United States was in there, and both were pushing their own gas pipeline. We know the U.S. wants the Trans-Adriatic pipeline to go through Greece to supply Europe, and we know that Russia wants the South Stream gas project to go through Greece and to supply Europe. And we can see right now that Greece is working with both the U.S. and Russia right now, and we see the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. Well, it seems at this point that they're going to begin this entire thing in mid of 2016. And we see the U.S. Department of State strongly back the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. And we can see that Russia is saying, okay, we would like to reboot the South Stream project. We would like to have the gas pipeline go through Greece. And Greece is still looking at this alternative. So they're looking at both. And we'll have to keep an eye on this situation to see what happens down the line. Now, Russia is warning other governments like the U.S. that they should stay out of other governments' business. Russia has warned against destructive external meddling in Brazil. They're hoping for a constitutional resolution of the current political crisis in Brazil with no interference from abroad. Now, we know the U.S. government, central bankers love to have coups d'etats. They like to meddle in other governments. If the government is not cooperating, not allowing them to do whatever they want in that country, they step in and they remove that government using NGOs. They create riots, protests. Everyone thinks it's a natural uprising, but in reality, it's driven by the U.S., George Soros, and other agencies. And right now, we see Brazil is going through a very difficult period in terms of domestic politics. And right now, Russia is keeping an eye on the situation because we have to remember Brazil is part of the BRICS system. And they're monitoring what governments are involved in trying to overthrow the governments in these areas. And of course, as we know, one of them is the U.S. Now, back in Ukraine, we know that MH17 was either shot down, brought down by missile, or both. At the time, we know the traffic controller was Ukraine. The southeastern people did not have that ability, so we know the traffic controllers had that plane fly over this certain area. But what's very interesting about this is that there was a young American killed aboard the airline. And Secretary of State John Kerry said that after 3 days after this happened, that he had evidence of who shot down the plane, satellite evidence. The father of the young American was asking John Kerry for the radar and other data that he cited back in 2014 because John Kerry claimed to know the precise location of the missile that was launched that downed the airliner that killed 298 people. In a letter to Kerry that he wrote back in January 5th of 2016, Thomas Shansman, the father of the American-Dutch citizen, asked Kerry to turn over the data to aid the investigation seeking to identify who was responsible for shooting down the plane on July 17, 2014. But Kerry is saying, no, sorry, I can't give you any of that information. Now, he expressed his condolences, but that's it. He did not provide any of the details or any of the information. Now, according to Dutch intelligence, we see that there was only one Buk anti-aircraft missile in the area, and it was under the control of the Ukrainian military. And we know the U.S. and other governments, other agencies, had satellites flying above Ukraine at this time because they were orchestrating the coup d'etat. They started up the anti-terrorism forces. They were going after the southeastern people, and they had to relay all the information back to the Ukrainian forces so they knew where everything was. And if Russia did provide a Buk battery, the U.S. would have picked up the 4 16-foot-long missiles hauled around by trucks. It would have been really hard to miss, and they would have picked it up, and it would have been plastered all over the place. But of course, as we know, the U.S. likes to say a lot of things, but they never back it up with any evidence. Now, out in Ukraine, we see over the last 24 hours, Ukrainian troops have shelled the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic about 253 times. The battle is still happening in Ukraine. It has not ended. And as each day passes, it continually heats up. Things are not quieting down. And we know that Ukraine has been training their armed forces with the help of the U.S., with other countries, and we know they're right at the contact line, and we know their plan is to get southeastern area of Ukraine and Crimea. The central bankers didn't get what they paid for, and eventually what's going to happen is they're going to have a major offensive. Something is going to kick it off, and the battle will begin once again. Now, the guided missile destroyer, the Donald Cook, it has returned to Europe, and it's going to be patrolling in this area. And we have to remember the Donald Cook was in the Black Sea, and at one point Russia flew one of its jets over, and it knocked out all the electronics in the Donald Cook, and the Donald Cook had to be towed off to port. But it has returned now, and we can see that they must have fixed all those different problems that it had. Out in Yemen right now, we see that tens of thousands of Yemenis are protesting the one-year anniversary of the Saudi attack, and demonstrators took to the streets, and they're out there protesting. They don't want the puppet government back, and they're getting ready for the peace talks that are going to start in April, so we're going to have to watch that situation very carefully. Now, out in Libya, we understand the elected government in Libya has set up alerts and warnings, and they are warning the unity government not to come into Tripoli. And we can see right now Libya has suspended air traffic at the airports east of Tripoli due to security reasons that are likely to be associated with the scheduled arrival of the UN-backed unity government. And they are shutting it all down because they don't want the unity government walking into Tripoli. They don't have permission. They are not the government. And the elected government in Tripoli is continually giving them warning. But we know the U.S. government central bankers and the coalition forces, their whole plan is to get the unity government in power, which will then allow the forces to come into Libya and get rid of all those pesky people that don't want the puppet government. And this is the showdown we're seeing right now. And we can see that trying all political avenues to try to replace the government. We see the UN stepped in. They created a new government. Even though the people don't want it, they're doing it anyhow. They're just creating things out of thin air, just like currency. And they're trying to convince the world that this is the new government. But under the Constitution of Libya, the elected government that is in Tripoli is the government. And they're telling this fake government, do not come in here. Now, if the U.S. government central bankers don't get their way, eventually they will resort to violence. They will resort to force. And that is an invasion of Libya. When all else fails, they go in with force. Now, out in Syria, we understand that Russia came in because President Assad invited Russia in to get rid of the terrorist problem. Now, the U.S. and the coalition forces, they were never invited into the country. They decided to go in there by themselves. Really, what they did was invade a sovereign country, and they're still in Syria, bombing different areas. But what's very interesting is, and we go back in time, the U.S. was continually telling us it was going to take years to get rid of the Islamic State. It was going to last forever, and it was going to cost billions and billions of dollars. Well, Russia stepped in, and within 5 to 6 months, they have liberated hundreds of cities and towns. And it cost them $500 million or so, compared to the U.S., where they spent billions of dollars. And Russia now, they haven't left completely. They're still in Syria, but they're letting Syria, the armed forces, take the lead. And from their mission in Syria, they're going to get contracts around 6 to 7 billion worth of new arms contracts because of what has happened inside of Syria. They approved their weapons. They showed that their weapons work. They showed that they have the ability to go in there and to complete a task, compared to the U.S., where they're still trying to convince us that it's going to take forever to get rid of the Islamic State, that we're going to have to be in the Middle East for the next 10 to 15 years. We're going to have to be in Afghanistan for 20 years. All of this is a complete illusion. The U.S. doesn't want to leave these areas. The U.S. wants control of these areas. They want troops in these areas forever. This is the only way they can keep the petrodollar intact for their system to continue on. Now we see Palmyra was liberated, and we see that Russia is going to come in, help get rid of a lot of the landmines. They're going to send in robots. The U.S. said, no, we don't want anything to do with that. We're not going to help whatsoever. And Putin congratulated Assad in liberating Palmyra. And we see at this point that the U.S., their backs are really against the wall here. They have lost the initiative in Syria completely at this point. And we see they're taking their focus and they're moving it to other countries. And they're definitely coming up with new plans. And they're just trying to formulate these plans, because how do you explain it to anyone? Look how long it took them to formulate the plan after the sarin gas attack in 2013. They tried all different things, which the Geneva 1, the Geneva 2 talks back in 2014, because we know the sarin gas attack was occurred in August of 2013. In the beginning part of 2014, they had the Geneva 1, the Geneva 2, and that didn't go anywhere. They waited for the elections in 2014. Assad was reelected, and all of a sudden, in July, August, we had the Islamic State appear out of nowhere. And then in 2015, what happened during the summertime once again? The U.S. started to bomb that area. So here we are in the beginning of 2016. Their plans are a bust once again. Russia stepped in, promoted peace, got rid of the terrorists, and the U.S. right now is backed against the wall. Now we see that the U.S. is continually saying that the munitions stockpiles have been drawn down. They don't have any other weapons. But in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. Air Force has begun sharing bombs with NATO allies. They've been loaning out munitions. And if their stockpiles are running low and are depleted, all of a sudden they have enough now to loan out. And who's paying for all of this? Oh, that's right. It's the U.S. taxpayer once again. So we've been paying for absolutely nothing, because they were never going after terrorists, like they told us. They lied. They were never going after terrorists in Afghanistan. They were never going after terrorists in Libya, in Lebanon, in Yemen. What they're really doing is using all of our taxpayer funds, where a lot of people work hard just to try to get by, and they're using it for their own agendas. Now, we see the peace talks, they are continuing. We see that the Syrian opposition, they're not ready for direct talks with Damascus just yet. And the next round of talks between government and several opposition delegations, they're expected in April. And we'll have to watch that situation to see where that goes. We see Syria is calling out to the U.S. saying, listen, if you want to fight terrorism, you should really join up with our government and Russia, and we can fight terrorism together. Because this is a problem for the world, right? You're saying terrorists are a problem. We should all fight together. And so far, we have not heard anything from the U.S. government. Now, remember, in the past, the U.S. government didn't want China, didn't want Russia, didn't want Iran, didn't want Syria involved in this whatsoever, because we knew the real reason of the mission. The mission was to remove Assad, and that is still the real mission. It's to remove Assad. Now, of course, their plans are a little messed up right now, but don't worry, they're hard at work coming up with brand new ones to get rid of Assad, and we're already seeing the beginning stages of this, where they had the Islamic State attack Belgium, and we're going to see a lot more of these attacks. Now, very interestingly, Turkey is continuing the fight in Syria. We see they let loose about 50 militants across the Turkish border to join al-Nusra in Syria, and they are now amassing in Aleppo. So Turkey is continually pushing the idea of war in this area, and we see at this point in time that as time goes on, Turkey is going to be the poster child for war. This seems to be their plan at this time, and it seems like we're heading down that path. Now, out in the Middle East and throughout Europe, we're seeing a lot of travel alerts and warnings. We're seeing the U.S. Department of State, they're warning the U.S. citizens traveling or living in Djibouti that there's a presidential election coming up, and it's scheduled for April 8th of 2016. And they're saying there's a possibility of spontaneous protests that might occur in that area, and they could turn violent. Very interesting, because as we know, the U.S. wants a certain person in power, and if it's not going that way, they will turn everything in the direction they want, even if they have to use protests, violence, or anything else. We see Israel. Israel is urging its citizens to leave Turkey. They're saying there is a huge possibility that something might occur in Turkey, which means Mossad is planning something like a false flag in Turkey to blame it on the Islamic State, because we know the U.S., CIA, Mossad, MI6, they're all involved with creating these false flags. And we're starting to see a lot of these warnings come out. We also see that the Islamic State, coming from all different agencies, saying that they have already planned their future attacks throughout Europe and the United States. Everything is set, everything is ready to go. And we see at this point, eventually what's going to happen is the U.S., Israel, the coalition forces, to get their way, they're going to push more and more attacks to scare the people into doing things they normally wouldn't do. We already see the attack in Belgium. We're already hearing more attacks. And we know the Islamic State at this point is being defeated in Syria. And it makes no sense for the Islamic State, which is the proxy army for the United States government, central bankers, to come out and say, hey, we're attacking this area, so bring in more troops into Syria to destroy us. It makes no sense whatsoever. The logic isn't even there anymore. Actually, it was never there. But we can see they're still trying, and they're still using the same tactics. They haven't switched it up yet. Because right now, their plans are falling apart. The economy is falling apart. It's getting worse. It's imploding on itself, and they're running out of time. And as they run out of time, they're going to resort to more and more false flags, and they're going to resort to the big one where they're going to have to blame this all on another country or group. And this is where we're headed right now. And we're getting closer and closer to that point. And we're most likely going to see more of these false flags accelerate as we go throughout this year. Because remember, the U.S. government, central bankers, all of Europe has been convincing us that the economy's fine. We've recovered. There's no problems here. And for the economy to crash all of a sudden, without blaming it on someone else, everyone is going to point their fingers at the U.S. government and the central bank. And they cannot let this happen. This is why they're preparing, getting ready for one of the biggest false flags we have ever seen. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.